The GCRF is a large fund focused on some of the world's biggest challenges, framed around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is a fund where we're using interdisciplinary research approaches to address the world's intractable or seemingly intractable health problems, and also climate problems and other problems that societies face. If you don't have economic development, if you don't have innovation which is going to deliver jobs, deliver careers, build the economy of the country, you are probably going to remain stuck with those problems of conflict, of infectious disease, of poor education. Because as the economy builds, you can also build these other areas of society, and development happens as a whole. So I would say in some ways we hear more desire from our low and middle income country researchers for the involvement of businesses and the economy and innovations that are commercial than we do from our UK community, who tend to be much more academic and much more focused on the sort of scientific and research-based discoveries. So it was an eye-opener to me to realise that actually our low and middle income country researchers are much more switched on and aware to the fact that you need to have holistic development, which is economic development and business-based solutions, as well as the scientific-based solutions. And actually the business-based solutions, in their view, could have a more rapid development impact than the basic science solutions, which may be 5, 10 years or multiple decades away from having impact, even if the impact can be very big, because they want to see some things that can have impact now, can have impact in the next few years, and perhaps, things which are already in a business space or a commercial space may be more ripe to have more rapid impact in developing countries. We're UK taxpayers, right? This is our money, so why should we be investing our money in development? Why should we be investing our money in research for development? And I think, the answer there is that we are not a country that is living in isolation. Yes, we are an island, but we are an island which is connected in so many ways globally. And in terms of, if you look at the development goals, then what is good for one country is going to be good for another. Infectious diseases don't respect borders. We are seeing the impacts of climate change globally. The impacts of conflict. They may start in the Middle East, for example, or the Horn of Africa, or anywhere else, but the impacts radiate globally extremely rapidly. And so I think in today's society, more than ever, we're seeing that the barriers to development in low and middle income countries are becoming barriers to development globally and impacting and slowing our own economies and our own lifestyles as well as others. So by investing in development, we are the beneficiaries of that as well. So you may think that the beneficiary is in the low and middle income country, but actually we are the beneficiary of that as well, quite directly in many cases.
My professional career started working for Save the Children in Lesotho in South Africa. So I always had a very strong interest and passion for child health. My inspiration for starting Apparito 5 years ago was just seeing the impact of asking children and families to travel to hospitals, how stressful they found it to take part in clinical assessment. And why does every test have to be so long, painful, and only be based in the hospital? So that's why I decided to change the way that we do patient monitoring and to offer them the opportunity to use innovation such as their own smartphone, wearable devices, video recordings to capture the disease impact aspects that are important to them. As you probably can imagine, most patients don't suffer from the symptoms right there and then in clinic with the doctors, and they always happen at night when they're away, when they're quite some distance from the hospital. So trying to encourage them to be able to capture and report that information in real time through using our technology. Through the Innovate UK funding, we were able to start our precision medicine study in Cape Town in South Africa. And I think from very early on, there was that natural fit that meant that we've never had friction or difficulty in, we've had challenges, and it's been, it's not to say that the work hasn't been easy, but because we all had the ultimate goal and the overall objective, it's made working with them extremely fruitful and productive. That funding allowed us to create a whole new concept and from start to finish. So as a company, it was a very exciting study to be involved in. And from a credibility point of view, the funding gave us a lot of credibility. The experience has given us a lot of sort of profile and learnings. And all these things together just sort of make you in a much stronger position to then translate it to other areas and seek new funding or contracts. For us as a company, since we secured or won the Newton Fund, we've actually gone on to secure 1.4 million investment, and we've also won around 12 different contracts with sort of now studies and patients across all 4 continents in the world. And that opportunity to start working outside of the UK and outside Europe was very informative and very critical for us in our business to be able to demonstrate that we could deploy our technology globally, and the South Africa experience was a key step in that.
Good morning, it's Jane Brookman here from the KTN, and I'd like to welcome you to the 5th and final day of the Southern and Central mission as part of the AgriFood Africa Programme. Now this morning, you will have already hopefully had a successful networking session, and we're finishing off this week with a panel on looking at some of the areas that have been maybe brought up throughout the week and looking forwards to the July wrap up of this session. So I'd like to start by asking each of the panel members to introduce themselves, and we'll start off with Catherine Miller. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks, Jane. Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Miller, and I'm Innovation Lead for Food and Nutrition at Innovate UK, and I lead on the GCRF AgriFood Africa Programme from Innovate UK's perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Now over to Rob Canavo.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Canavo. I'm here in the role, I think, of as honorary business ambassador for the South African Chamber of Commerce in the UK. I also run a small consultancy called Codex Capital South Africa, which basically acts as site consultants to multinationals that are looking at setting up in South Africa. And yeah, look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Melody, may I ask you to go next?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Melody Mens-Kutsia. I'm a research at the University of Pretoria, based in South Africa.
Thanks, Melody. And finally, Mike.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Shaw. I'm the Managing Director of Wellspring Development Capital. We are a company who advise UK government institutions, African governments, and private sector companies and investors in agri-technology and agribusiness projects.
Thanks very much, Mike. Well, as you're on the microphone already, maybe I could start the questions off with you. So I'm aware that Wellspring has worked with the Gatsby Foundation to produce a number of studies on the role of finance for the ag sector. But how do you see that playing out? What role do you think technology and finance have together to improve food security and nutrition in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, obviously, they're all intertwined. When you're looking at trying to change or improve a food system, finance, and technology are key parts. I suppose you have to look at it in the whole. So finance is critical. Having the appropriate technologies is critical, and then alongside that, obviously, supporting policies and skills and capabilities of individuals, I suppose, are all of the key ingredients we need to be seeing. On the finance piece, it's always tricky because when market systems are working well, or when they're more developed, financial systems can come in and support new businesses or new products, or help companies expand, or help you bring in new technologies into the market. In the case of least developed countries, or certain aspects of emerging economies, especially in regards to agriculture, the reality is sometimes purely commercial finance. So finance that comes from banks or private equity or companies themselves can't justify you can't justify using purely commercial finance in introducing new agricultural technologies, because the risk outweighs the return you're going to get on the finance. So that risk return spectrum is the key thing we look at. And so that's where there's a case that a new technology or a change in an innovation system can be changed for the better, and there's a public good that can come from that in terms of increased nutrition, increased food security and resilience. And obviously now with the whole COVID-19 thing, it's even more critical than ever. It creates the rationale and the support for certain forms of what we call concessional finance to be used. So examples of that are wide-ranging and increasingly sophisticated. So from one end of the spectrum, it's grants, and everyone knows about that. And Catherine's here from Innovate, who supplies certain types of competition-type grants and finance to help stimulate new technologies and innovations and partnerships. But then there's a whole spectrum between that and purely commercial ton and bank type finance as well. So we have the UK, for example, has DFIs such as CDC Group, who provide debt and equity financing that's willing to take higher risks and get slightly lower returns than purely commercial banks, and that sits in the middle. And then there's a whole range of other financing mechanisms such as credit guarantees and things like that. So in that space, so if whether you're an African agribusiness or technology company or a UK agri-tech company, often if you're looking to bring new technologies in, gain a foothold and develop them and take them to market and really get to the point where they're commercially viable and scalable, you will need to interact with these forms of concessional finance and pull together these sorts of projects. And so that's a space that's important for people to understand and navigate. And the UK offering is quite deep and varied on that in terms of DIT, DFID, Innovate. I mean, KTN, obviously, you guys sit in the middle, bringing all these actors together and helping broker these partnerships. So that's the sort of landscape in a nutshell, if that's useful.
Thanks very much for that, Mike. So I'd just like to remind anybody on the live stream that if they could put their questions into the Q&A part of the YouTube channel or on Facebook similarly. I'd like to now ask Melody a point about building on Mike mentioned about the role of grants and the academic base within the development space. But if you think about the GCRF AgriFood Africa, one of the things that we're trying to do is to help address large targets such as improve mother and child nutrition through improving the implementation of appropriate technology and development studies. So do you think that South African universities see their role as implementers of that within a local context, or do you think that they maybe consider their research ideas much more within an international collaborative sort of approach, or is it a mixture of both?
Thank you so much for the question, Jane. I think you prompted very well at the end of your question by saying, is it a mixture of both? Because it's certainly not a dichotomous choice between can we be internationally competitive or should we be locally relevant and impactful? And that one can have excellent quality, internationally competitive research that is making the difference on a local level. And I think if you look at the University of Pretoria's mission and vision as an example of how universities in South Africa are really trying to address those dual goals and make those contributions, where the vision specifically states that we're seeking to be globally competitive, produce high quality research, but that research is relevant and that research is seeking to make impact at a local level, but also, if you think of Southern Africa, at a regional level, and how we see our role as partners in this bigger ecosystem. So whilst our role might not be to implement everything, our role certainly is as a partner within this broader system with business and with the public sector and with a wide range of stakeholders to each bring our different contributions into the space where we can figure out what are the kinds of solutions that we need to meet some of these big targets and indicators around food security and nutrition.
Thanks very much, Melody. I guess I'd like to now sort of maybe move that question along to Rob. And whilst I apologise for asking Rob to represent the entire industry of South Africa, I'd just be interested in his views on what he thinks the responsibilities are and both the real responsibilities and perhaps the perceived responsibilities of businesses within South Africa to support these changes in diet and living standards and to maintain the progress that's already been made. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks. Yeah, I think you mentioned the word innovation earlier, and I think if you look at the South African context, probably South Africa's biggest export to date is probably the world leader in innovation. So Elon Musk, who we're all familiar with, is actually from the same town as where Melody is based and where I'm from Pretoria, and we went to school in Pretoria Boys High. And I think if you look at what he's driving in terms of innovation globally, I mean, with the Tesla projects and the SpaceX projects, South Africa has produced probably world leaders and has been at the forefront, in this space. On the agricultural side, we're no different. Just for people out there, I mean, it's important to note we've got a sort of a vast production of sectors in the agricultural space. And South Africa is also the third largest supplier of fruit and vegetables into the UK, just as a matter of interest after Spain and the Netherlands. So we really are sort of at the forefront in the sector. When it comes to supporting innovation and technologies, I know there's a number of initiatives out there. Melody is probably closer to them. We've got the CSR, which is the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, and within them, we've got the National Research Foundation and the Agricultural Research Council, whose primary drive is to basically partner the gap between innovation and policies. So I know they've been supportive and they've been driving. I think the Agricultural Research Council was established just after '94, I think in 1996, although the CSR has been there for the last who knows how many years, but together and in tandem, I mean, I know that they've been driving, change, especially in the sector. So if you look at sort of the South African agricultural sector on the whole, and if you speak to, experts in the field, so despite the successes that we've had across the fields from vineyards to the citrus crops, a lot of the farmland that South African farmers farm on would not normally be considered sort of farmland in other countries. So basically farmers on themselves have been extremely innovative over the last couple of years. And I think with the support, there's huge support from the government side and from academic institutions to sort of drive this change. Obviously it's never enough. But I know there's a number of programs that are in place that are looking at addressing these issues.
Thanks, Rob. And would you say that there's a good sort of environment maybe for collaboration with other companies and other universities within sort of the South African business environment? Are they willing and happy to engage in collaboration?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be the South African Trade Commissioner to the UK up until 2010, and I can tell you, I mean, South Africa's relationship with the UK is obviously extremely, favourable, and a lot of our institutions and laws and regulations are based on UK models. So there's definitely an openness and willingness to partner. I mean, I can mention, for instance, the National Research Foundation, together with the Newton program on the energy catalyst, they did have some close collaboration. So under the chamber role, we're looking at putting something together with the Agricultural Research Council on a similar sort of model. But I mean, obviously, once things develop, we're going to be pursuing that as well. But absolutely, I mean, especially from a UK perspective, and I think Melody will attest to this, you'll find South Africans extremely open to collaboration. I mean, we realize we don't have all the answers. We've still got huge challenges to address. So there's definitely willingness to learn and, sort of benchmark from what has been done.
Lovely. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
We have a question now from Duncan Ross, and I think this might be a question to both Catherine and Melody. Maybe if I ask you, Catherine, first for your thoughts and then move to Melody. What would you suggest would be the best way of making links into the African continent through relevant universities?
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Duncan, for the question. I think one of the best things you can do is to contact KTN and also have a look at the Meeting Mojo links. So with the networking, there are various organisations from across Africa who have a profile on there, so you can contact them through there. And also, we've funded or in the process of funding 70 projects of UK organisations working with African organisations. So we do have a lot of links through to a number of different African universities. So if there's a specific university you want to contact, or if there's a specific area that you're looking for expertise, contact us and we'll hopefully be able to point you in the right direction.
Thanks, Catherine. Melody, I don't know whether you have any additional views to add?
Thanks, Jane. Nothing specifically, but what in terms of connecting to a specific university, but just to mention that there really are several very active networks. So networks of African universities, like the African Research Universities Alliance. In the agriculture and food security space, you have the Roof Forum platform. And I think these network spaces, which are very active, are also great ways to make linkages because they're not limited to a single institution. And you have that opportunity to connect into multiple institutions, which of course really just expands the opportunities to connect with people who are working on something that may be similar or of interest to you. So I find that the research networks and the university networks that are Africa-wide are really great spaces to connect into as well, if you're seeking to build linkages.
That's a great response, Melody. Thank you very much. And maybe I'll catch up with you later on to get those contact details, and we'll make sure that they're available on the GCRF AgriFood Africa website. Thanks very much. Catherine, may I go back to you now? So you've spoken a little bit about some of the funding that's taking place. What sort of projects have already been funded in this area by Innovate UK?
Thanks, Jane. We have funded a number of projects now through the Agritech Catalyst, and these are all projects that have UK partners and African partners, and really aiming to address some of the challenges across the agri-food landscape in Africa. And Cobus gave a really good summary yesterday in one of the presentations. It's worthwhile having another look at that if anyone is interested, just to really give an overview of the challenges across the system. And just as an example of some of the projects, we have funded projects around livestock disease. So for example, we have funded a project looking at East Coast fever, which is a major constraint on smallholder cattle production. And the idea of the project is to develop a replacement vaccine that is more stable and will hopefully result in an extra 300,000 cattle being effectively immunised each year. We've also funded a similar project looking at new vaccines that are more stable and more efficient, and also match circulating strains, looking at foot and mouth disease. So another big issue. Outside of livestock, we funded a project looking at portable genetic analysis, which is used to support certification of seed and farmer-bred varieties of seed, which can then add value to that supply chain. And one project as well that's been profiled yesterday, there was a presentation by Sven Pietz, which was an AGCO project, so looking at the benefits of mechanisation through farmer-led service, a farmer service centre, known as sort of farm in a box, and looking at sort of how that is financially viable as a business model. And that's working, excuse me, with partners in Zambia. We've also funded a project identifying wheat lines which show resistance to aphids, which can then be bred into wheat varieties, which can be subsequently grown on smallholder land. And that's been a project in Zimbabwe. So there's a number of different projects. We've also funded projects using non-food crops. So Kalahari melon seed oil as an example. So it's a high value seed oil that can be used for cosmetics. And this project is really looking at proving the efficacy of the melon seed oil and looking at the best production practices and how to make that process economically feasible. So a really wide variety of projects, from livestock to plant genetics to non-food uses of crops. So lots of different ideas there.
Thanks for that, Catherine. I have a question here for Mike. I beg your pardon, Mike. What tips would you give to any small company from the UK if they were thinking about trying to exploit their technology or to enter into a collaboration with an African partner. So what makes it different or better or worse from doing business in the UK markets, I guess?
Yeah, I think, I suppose my main advice is sort of stick to basic principles. I think sometimes there's a lot of, if you're, for UK companies, if you're not familiar or if you don't have previous experience operating in or living in or doing business in Africa, it can seem daunting. It's not somewhere that you're as familiar with versus the UK or your European markets. So the first thing is I suppose I'd say don't be daunted. It's a very exciting, very rapidly growing economy, one of the fastest growing economies COVID is having its wicked way with all global economies, so who knows what's going to happen at the end of all of this. But prior to COVID, for example, the Sub-Saharan Africa, I think was growing at 8%. Annualized GDP, something like that. So probably the fastest growing economic markets on the planet. And then when you look at, it's doubly exciting because you've got this rapid urbanization. So you've got this shift of people from rural and sort of rural subsistence livelihoods in many cases towards urban and in the growing kind of urban middle classes, which creates especially fast growing markets for food and food production and processed foods and all the rest of it. So it's that food market and food technology market is growing especially fast given the dynamics. But enter with caution, like with any market. You need to go through first principles. So my advice would be, first of all, find people in country, whether it's going through talking to KTN and people like that, and the department DIT officers and other or your commercial contacts, and just first of all understand the economic realities of the sector you're trying to get into. So the first question I guess you have to make is, what country do you want to enter into? Do you want to go in at a regional level or a country level? Secondly, what's the competitive dynamics for your particular product or service in that country? And are your products and services really viable and realistic? If not, what would it involve to adapt them or create new ones that can be competitive in that market? I think sometimes where people can go wrong is trying to come into this market saying, well, here's my widget, or here's my service that sells well in developed kind of Western markets. Now I'm going to go and try and push that into Africa, or I'll go to a trade show with it or whatever. And if you can completely miss the market because it might be too big, or it might be too complex, or it might be too expensive, or it might not have it might not meet the market requirements. And that's where things get more interesting, because in a lot of developed markets, that market intelligence, that around what's the size of the market, who are my main distributors, who are my main competitors, what are the price points, what are the volumes, and everything, is relatively easy to gather, because they're more formalized, structured markets. In a lot of South Africa is a little bit different, obviously, but for Sub-Saharan Africa now, the least developed countries, that quality data is less available. So the first thing you have to do is to kind of get your detective hat on, really, and then work through partnerships, go approach KTN and people like that to try and to get that deeper level of intelligence on the market. What's the size of the market? Who's my competitors? What are the regulatory barriers or opportunities that might be in place? And then make an assessment. Is do I have a viable product or service, or if not, what changes will I need to make in order to be competitive? Once you've sort of got that, then you can start creating a kind of market entry strategy, I suppose, in terms of what would be a sensible way in. Often, I mean, it's different in every case, but often you might be better off making a regional play. Some of these markets are still relatively small compared to the developed world markets you might be used to. So you might want to target, for example, Southern Africa or East Africa, and then come into a particular hub or country and then try and service it more broadly. And there's often trade deals within those trade blocks. Southern Africa have COMESA and SADC, East Africa have the East Africa Community, so that once you're in one country or you've met the regulatory approvals or your technology is registered and approved in that country, it's often then easier to trade more broadly within the region. Another thing, stop me if I'm going on too long, but another thing that's really critical that people misunderstand is then but the buyers and consumers is the massive benefit that comes from people being able to see and test and try your technology. So getting it in country to begin with, even if it's at a trial or a pilot level at a small farm or with one sort of preferred buyer, just so everyone else can go and have a look at it and see it working and see it functioning. Cannot be underestimated.
And get a toehold in the area.
Get that toehold, and then really understand who's going to be servicing. And also then a big thing that people are being burned at, speaking from an African buyer's perspective, is when you're dealing with foreign suppliers, the first thing you're asking is, where am I going to get my spare parts? How am I going to get it serviced?
Yeah.
So that's something also you have to consider. So don't go in lightly, but do see it as a very, very high potential market.
Thanks for that, Mike. Now I have a question which is probably not too surprising, and Mike touched on it very briefly, around what's going to happen after COVID. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in Europe, so we probably Southern and Central Africa has probably no more idea than we do. But maybe just some thoughts from Melody and for Rob, from both the university innovation point of view, from Melody in the first instance, and then maybe a broader business view from Rob. So Melody, may I ask you for your thoughts on what life's likely to be post-COVID?
Wow, the treacherous territory of predicting the post-COVID new normal. I think, the challenge is that we don't know what's going to happen. And of course, I think we're going to see many of our challenges emerging. So you've had a lot of people thinking around in the food system space, what are some of the challenges that we could see arising? And we've had some things starting to pop up, but I think over the next 18 months to 2 years, depending on how long things last, we're really going to see, what the challenges are. A challenge related to that is, do we have the systems intelligence in place to be able to pick up on what the gaps are and the challenges are that need intervention quickly enough? So for me, from a data space, innovation space, are we able to pick up quickly and respond quickly? And there, of course, lies the opportunity to intervene on good intelligent data. The one last comment that I want to add, a big challenge that we haven't really touched on issues of gender much in our discussion today, but a big challenge with COVID is the risk that in the crises and in the chaos, that women and vulnerable groups are left even further behind, and that they are impacted and disadvantaged in the COVID-19 crisis more than others. And I think this is something that we have to be conscious of. And in looking at how we want to define our new normal, how we want to move through the challenges of COVID, we have to put the gender agenda at the forefront and make sure that we don't lose the gains that we have been making in this regard.
That's really helpful comments. Thank you, Melody. And we will come back to the gender question in a moment. Rob, can I just ask for maybe 1 minute on your thoughts on South African business post-COVID?
Sure. I mean, I've been lucky enough to be involved in sort of sub-Saharan Africa, with sort of various multinationals. What I is that, from a multinational, companies are looking at sort of reducing their or shortening and tightening their supply chains. In terms of the agri-food space, of course, this is across different sectors, so for textiles and light engineering and mining and so on. When it comes to the agri-food space, I think we're seeing companies that are going to be sort of sourcing locally and making locally and selling locally. And I think that's going to be a huge opportunity for Africa and Southern Africa in particular, especially in the agri-food space, where you're going to have a lot more sort of value added that's being done sort of on the ground, and of course it's a huge opportunity for all of us to be aware of, you know.
Thank you, Rob. I'd very briefly like to catch up on Melody's comments about gender towards the end of this discussion. I'd be interested, Melody, to hear your views on this, because looking at the innovation and skills area, I was looking at the UK gender numbers, and to be quite honest with you, they're not amazing in their own right. In the UK, core STEM graduates for the what might be called harder sciences are around 25%. It's thought that women in agriculture account for about 28%, but there are some quite unusual differences in the fact that food and nutrition science, for example, most universities within the UK say that around 80% of women are actually make up the food and nutrition sciences. Now, we're all aware that smallholder producers in sub-Saharan Africa tend to be women, but what is your impression of the gender balance in the higher education and innovation spaces within agri-food?
Thanks, Jane. So I think if you look at South Africa's higher education system as a whole, we actually have a very positive gender parity index of 1.4. So if we look at all disciplines, women are more likely to be participating in higher education in South Africa than their male counterparts. But similar to the UK, we do still have a gender gap when we look at science, engineering, and technology enrollments. So where women make up close to 46% of all enrollments in SET fields. That proportion has been increasing, so efforts and interventions to increase the participation of women in these fields are yielding a result, but it's an ongoing task and we need to do more. If we look at agriculture specifically, so that's one component of the food system in higher education, we've seen some very positive trends in terms of female doctoral enrollments in agricultural studies. So back in 2000, we had 60 female doctoral students enrolled in higher education in South Africa. And if you fast forward to 2015, we had 463 enrolled. So we are starting to see, not only at the undergraduate level, but even at the doctoral level, that the gender profile in agriculture is changing. On aspects such as nutrition, we do see similar trends in South Africa, that there are parts of the food system where enrollments in dietetics and nutrition studies, for example, are biased in the opposite direction, with far more female enrollments than male enrollments. So in summary, I guess we're making good progress, but we need to continue the good work to make sure that we really do achieve that parity across all disciplines and in all fields at all levels.
Thank you, Melody. That's a very, very good answer there. So I'd like to just now ask all the panelists, we've touched on COVID, and one of the reasons that we're actually doing these virtual missions is because of the COVID situation, obviously. So I'd be just interested very briefly if you had any ideas of the types of activities that you think our project should be doing, whether virtual or in real life, over the course of the next year or so. Obviously, if you don't have any views, that's fine too. But anybody would like to chip in with some ideas, maybe? No? Perhaps go to Catherine then.
Yeah, so I think in terms of projects that are already running, obviously some of those projects have had quite a difficult few months. And I think sort of the main things that people are trying to do is to try and just keep the projects going, so to keep collaborating. So if that means that you can't get into the lab, or you can't travel between states, you can still communicate, you can still plan what you're going to do within the project. And I think that's key for just keeping things going until more physical access to buildings or actual meetings is possible. So yeah, I would just recommend keep communicating. You can still work at project ideas, you can still develop collaborations online, whether that's through sort of virtual Zoom meetings, or whether that's just on the phone, on WhatsApp. Just if you've got an idea, just keep it going while we can't do anything else.
Keep on keeping on, Catherine. Okay, well, I'd like to, I've just realised the time. We're actually running 6 minutes over. That's always a good sign, isn't it, that we didn't notice that we were running over time. I'd like to thank all of the panellists this morning. We've had what I hope you will feel is a really genuinely interesting discussion about the situation between UK and Southern and Central Africa, and maybe some of the desires for the future. Next week, we will be looking at the eastern region of Africa, and I would encourage you all to continue networking and to consider looking at some of the opportunities for next week. I'd like to thank you all, and as I say, thank you very much to all the panellists. Goodbye.
Bye.